Hello guys, welcome to the Wars and Weapons channel. In my last video, I talked about World War One and to tell you some of the most basic details. And I also told you that I want to make the channel a multi-niche channel, and I will check the votes next week so I can see does the channel become multi-niche or not. Anyway, let's get on to the video now. In this video, as we all know, the drill of the channel is that we talk about the war and then we talk about some of the weapons used in the war, and then we go on talk about another war, or we talk more about the weapons. So now, just like the drill, in this video, we're going to talk about the weapons that were used and even invented during the First World War. Now, as I said, World War One just started by the Serbs assassinating the Prince of Austria-Hungary, and then the Austro-Hungarians decided to declare war on the Serbs, and then World War One broke out after multiple nations started joining. Now, I'm going in this video to talk about a weapon that was invented during the World War One, because World War One was a pretty massive conflict and many nations got caught in it. Now, some of them didn't have the needed weapons to fight against some of the other nations. So they started developing new weapons, and such as aerial vehicles started evolving even more than what they were back when before World War One. So like most of the countries that didn't have an air force, they started producing aerial vehicles in order to strengthen their air force and some of the other things. Now, one of the most effective weapons used in World War One was tanks. Now, tanks actually were invented during World War One to fight Germans by the British. Now, there were some early models, just some vehicles that had armor, on their sides, and then they were armed usually with a small machine gun or a small turret. But tanks were just basically they were made in order to fight extremely long durations, such as those cars or armored cars. They were just to go on and carry personnel or sometimes fight infantry or small enemy targets, such as like small artillery, and some of them even had small cannons in order to fight enemies that were light armored. Now, tanks, though, they were equipped with usually heavy turrets and tons of ammunition, because the main thing they had to do, they did not transport units, they did not fight against light infantry or anything like that. They had to go on into full combat and fight against anything that might be in front of them, no matter what it is. Artillery, they have to fight artillery. Infantry, they had to fight infantries, which is why they were armed with usually multiple machine guns and usually heavy turrets. Now, the earliest prototype of a tank were the land ships. Now, the land ships were just basically, I don't know what it's called, but it's something between a square and a diamond. So that's basically how the earliest version of the land ships looked like. And then they were armed with two turrets on the sides in order to be able to fire with two turrets on each side, and in case the enemy was on the right side, they can fire it with the cannon on the right, and if the enemy was on the left side, they can fire it with the one on the left. Now, this had some disadvantages, such as if an enemy came too close and came like this and were in front of the tank, they could not fire at the person in front of the tanks, unless it was infantry, so they had like a machine gun in front. So they could easily fight them, but if anything like a small armored vehicle came near them, they could not fire at it at all, and it could easily just start firing its small shells until the armor was penetrated. Now, the main reason they invented the tanks was that they wanted to find a way to deploy artillery that can move across the battlefield faster and while being protected, such as like pushing a cannon from terrain to terrain, such as like from behind one building to behind another building. It was extremely hard and it wasted a ton of time, and also it did not provide enough protection, such as like a single infantry unit could just aim at whoever is holding the cannon, like pushing the cannon, and then they would fire, and the person that was pushing it would die. So the artillery would just be halted over there, and most of the infantry that weren't trained with artillery could not use it. So they invented the tanks in order to be able to move their artillery from side to side and provide protection for the crews that were inside so they can move the artillery. That's basically the main reason the tanks were invented. Now later on they evolved to be like for multiple purposes, and like the name tank itself also has a pretty uh, has a pretty nice story. Now the story behind the name of tank was because like the Germans, they were trying to focus on firing at British tanks. Now the tanks at the time were called land ships, but the British were trained to call them tanks instead of land ships because, as I said, a tank is like a tank, and it's also like a tank, like you store water in it. And then there's a tank where like it's a vehicle, you know, the tank, and the other water tank, like something like that. They were trained to call them tanks so that when the German scouts hear them, they think they're for transporting water and liquids throughout the front line. Now, as like if you have the enemy having like a water tower and like a tank, which one would you target first? Of course, you would target the tank, because even if you do destroy the water tower, the tank is still going to try and destroy you no matter what you do, because they will rebuild the water tower. But rebuilding a tank at the time, at least, was hard, due to the fact many countries weren't industrialized that much. So the Germans were basically trying to find these land ships and fire at them, be it artillery, their airplanes, and many other things that they could destroy tanks. So the British were told to call them tanks, so that the Germans think it's, as I said, for transporting liquids and water around the battlefield, so they don't put them a priority to their target until they can fully utilize them and make them fight against the Germans. And then they would call them land ships in the battlefield, because it would make no difference if they don't call it a land ship. So that's basically the story of how the tank was invented, why it was invented, and how it got its name of tank. Now the tanks, as I said, later on evolved and like got their shape today as we see. Now the main reason it got its today's shape was because, as I said, if an enemy was directly in front of you, it would be pretty hard to fire at. So they decided, why not just make something that can fire in all directions? So they decided to make something that spins in all directions so that they can fire up at any enemy anywhere. So they created our today's tanks, which can basically fire over at their left, their right, their front, and even their back, something that no tank at the time was capable of. Now they also were armed with machine guns, as I said, in order to fight infantry, and they even got armed with heavier machine guns later on, with more and heavier on the top of the tank instead, so that they can fire up in all directions at infantry and even at aerial vehicles in order to shoot them down, so they can't like shoot at shoot at your troops on the ground. Anyway, that's basically how the tanks were invented, their evolution, and basically why they were invented. Anyway, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the war bell to be notified for the rest of the wars that will occur on the channel later. Thank you for watching again, and stand by for the next video.